Ok? Então, estamos... Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here together once again. I would like to invite everybody for a silent prayer. Nós vamos orar. Eu não estou ouvindo a Gabi. Amen. We are here together today to talk and study about the fall of the King of the South. Today, the plan is to go through the war, the movements in the war. A brief introduction now. The United States issued warnings in December 22nd about the Russian troops on Ukraine's borders. And President Biden threatened President Vladimir Putin of Russia with sanctions. If he launched an invasion in Ukraine. The Russian troop buildup began. Moscow and its online army of allies have pushed out old arguments. Okay, the Russian troop buildup began, and Moscow and its online army allies have pushed out on old arguments. So Russian allies and these old arguments about Western Ukrainians being aligned with Nazism. Falsely accused the United States of using proxy forces to plot a chemical attack. And claiming that Russia's planned military operations were intended to protect ethnic Russians. Intend to protect ethnic Russians on preemptive action by NATO. Propaganda can easily move beyond the Russian-speaking audience, we know. Intelligence officials have said that while Russia is unlikely to change, many minds in Europe. Its messaging has had more traction in South America and Africa. In the waters about which country is responsible for the Ukraine crisis. Much like its efforts to divide the American electorate in 2016, by stoking debates about racism, guns, and other device issues. Russia is trying to increase polarization in Ukraine. To give it a tactical advantage. This was said by Mr. Murphy, the former head of the Department of Homeland Security Intelligence. He was at the department from 2008 to 2020. And he said that, claiming that NATO interference in Ukraine has long been a started line of attack by Moscow. He said that claiming NATO interference in Ukraine has long been a started line of attack by Moscow. The department said, in fact, she'd issue last week that much of disinformation repeated old themes. Last week, that much of disinformation repeated old themes. Such as portraying Russia as victim of US, such as portraying Russia as victim of US, depicting Western society as the one verge Western society as one on the verge of collapse because of they verge of collapse because of they moved away. Away from traditional values. And describing Washington as the supporter of revolutions in the region. Okay. Now we will go through the war, month by month, on a timeline conflict. From 2022 to 2023. In February, the invasion begins. Russia invades Ukraine on February 24th. In northern Ukraine, as tens of thousands of Russian troops try to take the Ukrainian capital and decapitate the country. Neighbor countries like Poland, Hungary, and Romania opened the doors to hundreds of thousands of refugees. Refugees pouring out of Ukraine. The United Nations overwhelmingly condemns Russia's aggression, and the West slapped sanctions on Moscow. On March, there was an horror in Bucha. Shockwaves from Russian invasion reverberate around the world. Food and energy prices climb as attention turns to the wider impact of the war. There are pointed concerns about the cost of living in the West. While food security becomes a hurry, across huge swathes of developing world. Huge swathes. Sim, sim. Russia forces encounter stubborn resistance around Kyiv. Russia begins cracking down on independent media. And festering opposition to the war inside the country. The war will not permit it at the time. Use of the term war. Instead, Vladimir Putin was using a special military operation. And in several local stations has been shut down. And access to foreign media restricted. In April, a new phase of war. A Russian missile strike hits a train station in Kramatorsk. Killing at least 50 civilians. Including women and children. And wounding more than 100. Most of them were trying to evacuate to safety. A suspect Ukrainian missile sinks the flagship of Russia's Black Sea Fleet. The Moscow. It is a major blow to Moscow's naval supremacy and military prestige. The parents start asking questions about the fate of their missing sons. As the authorities remain tight-lipped about casualties. On the ship 500-strong crew. Nearly 200 of Ukraine's children are now displaced by war. Which says the UN. Back in March 22. I was just pointing that the UN said about these children back in, it said March, but April. for sure now has been much more. In May, NATO grows. Sweden and Finland, the pair were closely aligned. Aligned with NATO for decades. But not formally part of the organization. Russian President Vladimir Putin has cited NATO expansion as one of the main reasons for invading Ukraine. But it appears the invasion has had the opposite effect. Of strengthening the Western military alliance. Fires in the Azovstal steam mill. Fires in the Azovstal. I guess I'm saying Azovstal is still. Fires, yeah, let me repeat. Fires in the Azovstal steel mill. Last pocket of Ukrainian resistance in Mariupol. Stop the white flag. In June, 100 days of war have now passed in June, last June, have then passed. Tens of thousands lay dead. Millions more are uprooted from their homes in Ukraine. From Ukraine, historical and cultural sites are devastated by fighting. Nike leaves Russia, become the last in the string of Western brands to exit the country. The war. However, there are still debates about Russia's economic resilience. And whether sanctions are the right approach. With some claiming they unduly affect ordinary Russians. And play into the government anti-Western rhetoric. And play into the government At that time, French President Emmanuel Macron visited Irpin. Outside Kiev in Ukraine. But Russia is not the only one struggling at that time. A global food crisis is looming with millions. Let me repeat. A global food crisis is looming with millions of tons of Ukrainian grain languishing in silos since the start of the war. Silos. Ukrainian forces recapture Snake Island. A tiny islet of the coast of southern Ukraine. The last city in the eastern Luhansk region falls to the grinding Russian invasion. And Ukraine's embattled forces focus on defending Donetsk. Second part of the prized Donbass. The Donbass heavily industrialized region in eastern Ukraine. Has become the site of the biggest battle in Europe in generations. Inflation reaches records heights in the Eurozone. With the euro and the dollar reaching parity. Russia begins to periodically shut down the Nord Stream gas pipelines in a pipelines. Pipelines. In a bit to ratchet up pressure in Europe. European leaders are spoken. Teetering on the edge of the energy Ukraine and Russia agreed to a landmark deal allowing Ukrainian grain. Allowing Ukrainian grain to be exported. Being exported across the Black Sea. It's a major breakthrough aimed at easing the global food crisis. HIMARS missiles from the US begin hitting Russian ammo depots. Logistics and command I will repeat. HIMARS missiles from the US begin hitting Russian ammo depots. Logistics and command and control systems. In August, the gas exports to Europe stopped. Powerful explosions rock an airbase in the Russian-occupied Crimea Peninsula. Ukraine and Russia have been flirting with catastrophe at the Zaporizhia. Zaporizhia is a nuclear power plant in southern Ukraine. But at that time, the UN chief, Antonio Guterres, says that he says that the pair should stop the suicidal attacks. On their plant. So the chief said both sides should end fighting there. Gas exported to Europe are halted on 1st of August. With Russia's state-owned energy giant Gazprom citing maintenance work on the Nord Stream 1 pipeline. Surge immediately. In September, mobilization. Ukraine launches a rapid counteroffensive in the northeastern of Kharkiv region. Sending Russian units to retreat. Zelensky raises the Ukrainian flag in the war-scared city of Izium. On September 10th. Occupied by Russia for 6 months, the city. It is a big strategic win for Kyiv. Putin announces a partial mobilization of 300,000 troops to fight in Ukraine. Targeting a mass flight of Russian escaping conscription into neighboring. So, targeting a mass flight of Russians escaping conscription into neighboring Georgia and Kazakhstan. The US claims hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian citizens are being forcibly deported to Russia. They are being forcibly deported to Russia in a series of horrors. Almost 1,200 protesters are arrested in cities across Russia after the call-up. As the authorities' vice-like grip on anti-war dissent tightens. Many of these demonstrations are in the areas populated by Russian ethnic minorities. Who claim they are disproportionately targeted by the draft. At the time, Russia officially annexes Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia. In September 30th. In a move branded illegal under international law. And Putin says the annexed regions will be part of Russia forever. October, sabotage. A large explosion tears through a bridge linking Russia and Crimea. Which served as a major supply route for Moscow forces fighting in Ukraine. This have happened one day after Putin's birthday. Kiev does not take responsibility for the blast. Through Russian points to Ukrainian terror. Russia's prestige in the region is due a stinging blow. Sorry, I will repeat. Russia's prestige in the region is dealt in a stinging blow. Russia begins bombing Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Oh my! Russia begins bombing Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Locking out power and heating ahead of winter. In Ukraine, and rising inflation plunge an additional 4 million children into poverty. This is according to an October report by UNICEF. A large proportion of them, 2.8 million, are Russian. In November, Kherson is liberated. Ukrainian troops pour into Kherson on November 11th. At the time, Poland is put on high alert after a blast near the Ukrainian border. And this explosion have killed 2 people. It turns out the deadly explosion was caused by a Ukrainian air defense missile. Inflation in Europe eases, but is still in painful double digits. Hiding 10% in November. Russia is hoping surging consumer price and new waves of Ukrainian refugees. And new waves of Ukrainian refugees will erode European leaders' resolve. NATO promises to admit Ukraine into the Western Alliance. Though there are considerable doubts over when Kiev will be allowed to join. In December, Green warnings for spring. Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, heads to the US. His first state visit outside the country since the start of the war. Joe Biden, the US president, promises to send Patriot air defense systems. To help Ukraine stave off Russian attacks on its energy infrastructure. Saying that Ukraine will never be alone. The US had been reluctant to supply this long-range weapon to Ukraine over fears of inflaming tensions with Russia. Moscow warns Washington over sending more weapons to Kyiv. Ukrainian authorities raise fears that Russia may try to take Kyiv again. To take Kyiv again in the new year. After its abortive offense at the start of the war. On Christmas Day, Putin claims Russia is ready to negotiate with Ukraine. A demand ruled out by leaders in Ukraine. Russian president publicly uses the word war to refer to his country's invasion for the first time. As we have said before, it was prohibited to use the word war until this time. Until that time, it was like 10 months after the beginning of the war. And at that time, Putin was referring to the brutal invasion of Ukraine instead of a special military operation. At that time, he finally called it a war. Setting off an uproar among anti-war Russians. Setting off an uproar among anti-war Russians have been prosecuted for merely changing the Kremlin-approved euphemism. Really challenging. Our goal is not to spin this flywheel of military conflict. Spin this flywheel of military conflict. But on the contrary, to end this war. That Putin said during a televised news conference. Following a government meeting on that Thursday. This is what we are striving for. And exactly what Putin has been striving for has been a subject of much consternation and debate, especially in Ukraine, where thousands have been killed and cities have been flattened. And in Western capitals that have been sent millions that have sent billions in weapons and economic aid to Kyiv. To help the country withstand Russia's aggression. Ultimately said that he is seeking to denazify Ukraine. Desnazificar, né? So in December, we finished already with December 2022. Now we start with January 2023. In January, amid mounting political pressure, Germany finally agrees to supply Ukraine with Leopard 2-barrel tanks. Paving the way for the US and other NATO allies to follow suit. Some hailed the move as a significant boost to Kyiv's war effort. which could enable fresh offensives. Though others questioned if the number of tanks was enough. And whether Ukraine would be able to use them effectively on the battlefield. Russia slammed it a blunted provocation. Almost as soon as the tank deliveries got the green light, began asking for fighter jets, something should flatly ruled out. After months of gritty fighting, Ukraine admits withdrawing from the eastern town of Soledar. Reversing Russia's military fortunes. Moscow has portrayed the fight as key of seizing the strategic town of Bakhmut. And the prized Donbas region. But the importance of the salt mining town is debated. Russia and Belarus began joint drills. Spiking fears that Moscow could use its ally to launch a fresh ground offensive in the spring. We have gone through this timeline of the war today. Until January. Tomorrow we'll continue with February. We will talk more about the consequences regarding our time. Regarding we can say we will talk about gender and the consequences regarding gender. So even though today was a little bit massive, too much information, tomorrow we will talk, and I will be putting again this study on the blackboard, whiteboard. Talk about the fall of the King of South. I thank everybody for being with us. And I ask everybody to be with us tomorrow too. So we can continue our camp meeting. I invite everybody to now to pray. Dear God, we are so thankful for your mercy with us. We want to be following the instructions that we have been received in this movement. And do what is supposed to be done by us. We want to be informing and receiving information so we can practice to be good teachers. To have our lives and others changed. Always tied to the cords. So those lines can conduct us. Having Christ intronized in our heart. Thank you for this camp meeting. Asking for a blessing over everybody that is now gathered together. So we will see these videos later. We're thankful for a new week that is starting for us here in Brazil. And for all those that are following us. That's our prayer for today.